Welcome to this last podcast in my podcast series around vertical development. In today's episode, I'm going to look into how do you actually develop from one stage to the next. So in the previous podcast, I covered how do you strengthen an existing capacity that you do hold, but you may not feel so comfortable with it, or you're not at ease when you have to practice a certain leadership behavior. In this one, I'm going to look into how do you then develop to the next one. And I can reveal right away that the actual process around working with your leadership development is more or less the same. So again, you apply the wheel, which is around, firstly, observe what it is you want to work with. Then when you've observed what you want to work with, then you analyze how you could work with it, or what is preventing you from doing a certain leadership behavior. And then you make a strategy how you can begin to implement it, begin to try something off, how you can do it, and then eventually you take action. So the wheel is kind of the same as in the previous one, but where's the big difference between working with an existing capacity and a new one is around identifying a new capacity, hence figuring out what to work on. And here it gets a little bit more challenging compared to working with something you already have tried, but just don't feel at ease at. Let's have a few examples. Let's first look into, for instance, a capacity that you don't hold right now, but where you have the help and support from maybe a good manager or a role model who demonstrates the behavior that you would like to do. So let's assume it's around coaching your employees instead of focusing on their task, what they're working on. So this example is around, you may be operating at the expert stage, which a very large part of leaders actually work on. And you want to develop to get to the second stage, which is called the achiever stage. You may have observed your manager coaching both you and other managers in your team. So it is something that you have observed, you've had a good role model in your leader, but you may for some reason not feel comfortable with coaching employees yourself. It may be caused by that you are operating very solidly as an expert. You're very strong in a given skill where you feel comfortable. That is where you have your knowledge. So going in and beginning to see a person instead of a given task that your employees are working with may be uncomfortable, because you get out in an area where you're not so strong as you are when you are vertically focusing on the task they're working on. So when you work with coaching an employee, it's around figuring out what is the root cause of a employee maybe having a challenge with a given task, or why they're not improving to the level you would like them to improve. So instead of looking at the task per se, which you may have done so far, you have to begin to identify an approach where you look at the person. So you begin to identify what is the challenge that this employee is having to develop. You may then, when you begin to apply a coaching approach, realize that this employee may not be motivated with what they're doing. They may not be in the right function, but it may also be caused by something external, something that is disturbing them so they can't concentrate, or whatever the reason may be. But the coaching approach have the difference that it helps people grow. It makes them aware that they may not be performing. They may be able to articulate what their challenge is, and hence you can work on a solution together. Whereas when you focus on the task in itself, it will very much be around how can you improve the task you're doing. It may be a presentation, an employee working on a presentation, and you improve the presentation time after time after time and makes it better and better and better. But at times, such an approach can also have the opposite effect, that it doesn't necessarily develop an employee, but may just reaffirm that they're not good enough all the time. So the balance between coaching and focusing on the task is imperative if you want to operate at the next level, the achiever stage. To bring another example, it could be stakeholder management or understanding of the value of stakeholders. Again, we're operating between how a typical expert leader is operating towards what the achiever begins to be able to do. And to give some context, where the expert typically operates, they're very silo thinking. So they're very focused on their task within a specialized area. And that makes them very, very capable of doing something, but in a fairly defined area. So for an expert leader to, for instance, seek input from stakeholders outside their own function would not be so natural. They may believe that others can anyway not really contribute much to what they're doing, or they may feel it slows them down if they have to involve more people in the process they're working with. They may also just believe that it's tiring to go out all the time because they know best anyway. So there can be different reasons for an expert not seeking that wider input from stakeholders outside their own function. But it also limits them to work within a very closed area and typically come across as silo thinking in their approach to solutioning, their approach to solving areas within their merit. If this expert leader then has a good role model or manager who again has the ability to bring in some wider context, help them identify that they would hugely benefit from developing a wider stakeholder management skill, then this leader or role model may be able to, by their own behavior, show how you do that in a good way. But they may also help you make a strategy for doing it. So they may be the one who is pushing you out and say, have you been out asking other people around their input and so forth? Because they may operate at a higher stage. They have a different view around what stakeholder contributes with, and they can share that with you. So it may be that you may then articulate to your manager that, well, it just drags down the process, and what do someone in marketing know about my area? I work in finance, for instance. But what it can create and what that leader or role model can help this person understand is that they may get an insight into a solution that they haven't thought about before. It may help them get out of that tunnel side where they're highly specialized to get some new perspectives. It may also add values because this person may know something about that topic despite you as a leader may not think they do so. So that more senior manager can help you begin to see stakeholders in a new context, help you identify ways to involve more stakeholders, and gradually, because you again observe you have a challenge, you make an analysis, what is it that makes you prevent it, maybe your thought process around what other stakeholders can contribute with. Then you do your strategy, and finally you end out going out and try it off, and then you begin to develop that capacity yourself. So here again, the strength of having a role model or a leader who operates at a level where they can help you identify it becomes imperative for that development. A third example could, for instance, be your ability as a leader to create visions that motivate, compelling visions that motivate people around you. So you may operate at the achiever stage, and you want to reach some of the characteristics of a catalyst, i.e. the ability to make more compelling visions and motivate teams in a different way. Here again, it comes down to, have you had role models who have demonstrated that to you? And do you have leaders and role models who can help you grow? So to give an example, if you identify this area that you want to become better at creating these, and you have a manager operating solidly as an achiever themselves, then it can be difficult to get that input to think differently. Because an approach from an achiever may be that they, despite their ability to coach you, they jump into the role of being a mentor. So you may go and say, I'm going to work on this strategy or vision for my department. I would like some help. And because they may not be so solid themselves, they may fall into the role of mentoring instead. They feel they need to have the answer right away. They will say, I think you should do A, B, and C, and then you'll get your result. That approach will give you the solution, and will also teach you how to do it in the future. But it also locks you in that this is the way to do it. Had you had a manager, or if you have a manager operating at a higher stage, that manager may be much more solid in coaching, not only around developing you, but also coaching you as a leadership style in a wider context. So that leader may instead ask you, you come and ask, I'm going to make this vision, how could I do it? Their first question may be, how are you thinking about executing that task? And you may say, I'm going to do A, B, and C. They may then ask, so what are you going to do after that? What do you expect to gain by doing it? What more could you do to do it? As you begin to run through that thought process yourself, you begin to understand what you're trying to do and what impact it may have. By giving these questions that educate you from your manager or your role model, or it could be an executive coach, you begin to grow as a person because your thought process is being widened instead of being locked in the previous example. So you may begin to think about, okay, this may not be so motivating, this may not be so fruitful as I hoped it would be. And because of those questions open up your mind, you begin to get new options and you begin to see it in a different light. So if you are exposed to a manager, role model, or an executive coach that can help you grow by asking these questions that educate, then you grow gradually yourself and you begin to develop a capacity that you didn't hold in the past. If you, on the other hand, is having a manager who is not necessarily operating at a higher stage than you and have a tendency to mentor more than to coach, hence the reason why coaching as a leadership capacity is very important if you really want to develop talent, then you may be locked into a given solution as being the solution for a given task. And for the next 20 years, every time you have to do something that is related to strategy or visioning, you will do it probably more or less in the same way, unless you at a later point of time get a role model or someone who points out that, have you thought about you could do it in a different way? So that was 3 examples of developing new capacities and how it can help you when you have leaders or managers or role models or external help, for instance, coaches, that helps you develop a new approach and can help you work out how you're going to develop it. One of the challenges when you want to grow in these leadership capacities is that the higher stage you operate at, the fewer you will find operating at a stage higher than you. It's back to the statistics that if you have more or less 80% of all leaders operating at the expert and the achiever stage, then it can be difficult to find many operating at the higher stages. One reason being that some corporates may not even have leaders operating at higher stages. And in the organization where they operate, you may not be exposed to them. So one of the challenges when you get to the higher stages to find role model operating at even higher stages can be that there will be less and less of them. And that is where external role models or coaches at times can help you. Not necessarily because they themselves operate at these very high levels, but because they can be a sounding board for your reflection capacity, your way of thinking, your way of addressing problems that enables you to grow in yourself, because you constantly get bounced back around your thought process and how can you do things in a different way than you've done it so far, and what can you get out of it. So basically, in the example with making a compelling vision, just the thoughts and the reflection questions around what motivates you, what motivates others, what does it do to you, what would it do to others, and so on, can make you begin to think about strategy and visions in a way where you appeal more to this part than this part. Hence, it begins to speak more to people than just making a generic one, we want to be the best in 5 years' time. Another point worth mentioning is that as you seek to grow in capacities, sometimes you will realize that a given capacity is a result of other capacities you hold, but just to a deeper level. So again, around creating visions that are compelling compared to creating visions that are more generic. That may be more rooted in your own self-reflection capacity, your own ability to empathize with other people and understand yourself. And those capacities, as you get deeper in those, will automatically change the way you see vision. So it doesn't become an active sort way of doing things, but it becomes a way that you just do things because it comes naturally in how you see yourself, motivation, understanding what can create energy and commitment from others and so on. So your understanding of that suddenly makes you make visions in a new way that you haven't done in the past. So sometimes working on a given capacity may be via a route where you strengthen a given capacity that you may hold at a given stage, but by deepening it and become much more firm and strong in a given capacity will create new results in how you do leadership. Hence, you begin to operate at a higher stage. Other times, it may be something you've never done before, but can be taught by good role modeling and leaders and so forth. So this is how you develop through one stage to the next. As you could hear, it's fairly similar, the wheel, how you go through the different stages, but the difference really relates to how do you identify what you want to work on. So at times it can be easier improving an existing skill because you have tried it, whereas other times you need someone to demonstrate how you can do things, or someone pointing out that you lack a given behavior that would hugely benefit you in your leadership style and approach. Then, just to sum up, I have a few remarks and typically questions. And one of them is, can everyone develop? And some people believe that not everyone can develop, and also some people believe that people are born in certain ways. I fully acknowledge that people are born different, and for some it would be easier to develop than for others. Some may have been born with better conditions for developing through their upbringing, through their way of being treated of different people, the amount of good role models they have had in their lives and so on. But still, everyone can develop. One of the big challenges, though, is to get out of that conformer approach that we all go through as we develop vertically. So at the conformer stage, it's all around staying within what we believe as a group, and other groups will probably be wrong. So when you operate at the conformer stage, it can be very difficult to break those boundaries. But as you get to the achiever stage, you're still bound to some extent by that mentality. So it can be difficult to think in developing yourself to the same extent. You may have role models, as I explained in the description of an expert leader. An expert can identify traits that they may not hold yet compared to their aspirational leader. They may also identify areas they want to improve in because they can see they want to become a better me. But often they are more struggling with getting that feedback around developing, and may not always take it as good as they probably would benefit from doing when they receive critique around developing. So as many people operate at the expert stage, what can be helpful for some expert is to get that push from someone. It could be a manager, it could be a condition for you staying in a given role, or for you to succeed to the next role, or for you to just grow as a leader. So for some it will be easier than for others. But I do truly mean that everyone can develop. It's around getting the right motivation, and for some at times to get that push where they realize that developing will benefit themselves. When you then begin to get into that development track, where you begin to see the benefit of developing and begin to identify that you've actually developed a lot the last 3 or 5 years, and what has it not given me, then the appetite and the self-drive for seeking input for further development comes more naturally. So one of the big barriers is at the first stages of the leadership vertical stages, where it's not so natural to seek input and seek development of yourself. A second point to raise is that changing behavior takes time. So we as human beings have a tendency to do things the same way. And one of the reasons being that for our brain, it's much easier to do things in the same way as we've always done. To take the example around brushing your teeth, if you do it with your right hand normally and you try to do it with the left hand, you'll see how much capacity you need to use in your brain to do it properly. So you may feel tired after having done your 2 or 3 minutes of teeth brushing. And next day, when you take your teeth bath again in the morning, you will go back to what you've always done. So our brain has a tendency to take the easy route. So the elephant trails that has been stepped down in our brain of doing things where we don't need a lot of energy to execute a given behavior is also hugely impacting our ability to implement changes in our own behavior. So don't get frustrated if you've finally gotten a new approach where you've begun to coach, for instance, your employees because you're developing from an expert leader to more towards an achiever. Just accept that at times you will fall back and you will have a tendency to do as you've always done. But having that conscious focus on you changing a behavior will eventually make you overcome it, and a new elephant trail will have been stepped down, and you will begin to do things in a new way as your fallback solution to a leadership challenge. A third point to raise is that visualizing can be very impactful and helpful when you are working on changing behavior. Again, back to the brain. Our brain works in a way where it doesn't differentiate much between an actual thing that has happened and something that it has thought about happening. So it's not around visualizing that you see a movie. It's more around visualizing you're there. To give you an example, you're supposed to make a presentation in front of a very big audience that you've never done before. Just coming in cold and standing on that stage would probably make you freeze, or you would be full of butterflies in your stomach and be very uncomfortable in the situation. However, imagine that you know where you're going to have that presentation. You've seen the venue or the stage you're going to stand on. Then, if you're going to visualize that you're going to stand on that stage, how you're going to articulate it, how you're going to look around at the different people looking at you. Some may look angry, not because they don't like it, because that's just how they look when they're listening. Others may be smiling and so on. So you visualize it, you think about how you would feel in the situation, what it would do to you and so on. So you're really there, but only in your mind. Doing that a couple of times prior to getting up on that stage will actually make you feel more comfortable in doing a thing you've never done before, because your brain has almost been there 2 or 3 or 4 times already. So it's not so new as it may be in reality. Then I mentioned in the previous podcast around role models. Role models are one of the most impactful ways of developing you, especially if it's good role models. But be mindful around the bad role models, because we are all role models for someone in one way or another. It can also be a role model for the way I'm not going to do it. But to give you an example, in the past where it was more usual that corporate had leaders operating by fear, so management by fear, if they were having an organization below them with managers who had been working in an environment where it has been management by fear, when they are promoted, there would be a higher tendency for these managers to step up and manage in exactly the same poor way as they were managed themselves. So poor role models are equally good at teaching behaviors as good role models. So make sure you choose the right role models that has all the positive things that creates good leadership. Then again, it's just worth mentioning as one of the last comments that stage built on stage. So back to the sports analogy, you can't become a first division football player if you don't master the basic things that you have been taught as you grew through the divisions. And the same in leadership. You cannot develop leadership capacities that are characterizing the highest stages if you haven't got a solid foundation in the lower ones. One of the reasons being that the higher you get up in the stages, the capacities are more and more rooted, or the new capacities are more and more rooted in a deeper self-understanding of yourself, a deeper reflection capacity, a deeper ability to put yourself in other people's place, i.e. your empathy, your ability to sense what it must be to be other people, try on other people's frames and so on. So if you haven't got your foundation strong, it can be difficult to really reach the higher stages. And that all comes back to that self-reflection that gives you the empathy. And as you become stronger in reflecting, which helps you deepen your self-awareness, then you begin to get into what is called self-leadership. So you begin to lead yourself better because you understand how you are, what is causing different things in you, what is resulting in different behaviors in you. And as you begin to lead that better and better, you get to self-mastery, where you can begin to control how you then react upon it, how you can develop from one stage to the next, how you can cope with different emotions in yourself and not let them influence you in the way you lead and act. Another thing worth mentioning is that leadership capacities are not intelligence driven. So you may be having one of the highest IQ on earth, but you still may have very little empathy. You may be very poor at reflecting upon yourself, but you're incredibly clever. So the intelligence in itself is not indicating whether you can grow in leadership capacities. If you're very, very intelligent and you're very, very specialized in a given area, it can at times maybe even be difficult to get out of that understanding that you're so good already, that you may not take on board that you're not so strong in social dynamics, you're maybe not so strong in empathizing with others, putting yourself in other people's place and so on, because you know so much about a given area. So intelligence doesn't decide which capacity levels you can reach or which leadership stage you can reach, but your willingness to work with yourself, understand yourself better, and develop your own behaviors, mind processes, things, ways of doing things and so on, is what decides how far you will develop as a person and as a leader. Then it's just worth mentioning in the end that these vertical leadership stages can help you identify where you are today and also what you could gain by developing to the next stage. So it gives you kind of an idea of what to expect if you want to work with yourself. Back to the sports analogy, you are operating in a given division, you want to get up to the next division because you understand that it gives you a very different perspective when you operate at that level. But you can also use this framework to, for instance, identify which capacities should leaders in general have in different leadership positions. So if you have a grading system where different leaders operate at different grades, where they have different responsibilities and so forth, you may identify that some of the capacities that characterizes an achiever should be in place if you're operating at this level. At a next level, you definitely need some of the characteristics of a catalyst to be successful and be considered as a talent and so on. Another area could be, for instance, graduate programs. A lot of big corporates have graduate programs where they take on board through a very, very long process a few talented people that will then go into a fast track in their development and their career progression. But often many of these corporates will focus a lot on the horizontal development of them. They will have people rotating to different positions. Some may even get to work in another country for a period of time, and they get a lot of insight into the strategy for the organization and so on. But not so often do they vertically develop the graduates. So these graduates may come out with a lot of new horizontal knowledge and a better understanding of the organization, but they may not be much wiser around themselves, their own behaviors and their own capacities. So by, for instance, identifying that if you're gonna have a fast track in our leadership funnel, then you need to make sure that you have some of the capacities, for instance, from the achiever. So we've pushed out these graduates from the expert mindset and uplifted them to the achiever mindset in some areas that are needed for them to really show that they operate at a higher stage than their peers do. And because graduates very often are young people just coming out of universities, a lot would be expected to operate at the expert stage when they start in their first job. So that's just a few ways that you can use this vertical development to more actively manage leadership in your organization, competencies, capacities, and also set clear expectations to what different people should be able to deliver at different positions in the organization. So this was the final podcast in my vertical development series. I hope you found it interesting. I hope it has taught you something. Maybe it has inspired you to work on given capacities yourself, or you have identified capacities that some of your employees may need to develop. And maybe it's helped you see leadership in a new perspective that you hadn't seen it in before. For me, vertical development as a framework has really changed the way I see leadership and the way that I work with leaders when I coach people. And it's not around labeling people, because labeling people rarely creates any good results. So it's not around saying you operate at this stage or you operate at that stage. There will be many reasons why we operate at different stages, but it can help us identify what to work on, especially if you may not have managers operating at much higher stages than you do yourself. Then it can be very helpful to see what there is out there that you may not be exposed to today. Partially because your manager may not operate much higher than you, or you don't have any role models in your near circle that can demonstrate different leadership behaviors that you're exposed to right now. So in that way, the framework really gives an idea around what it requires to get up to the very high stages where the capacity gets wider and where you have a much bigger toolbox of ways to leading people. That enables leaders at the higher stages to deliver very different results than leaders operating at the lower stages typically can. If this podcast has made you reflect upon something, do leave the commentary in the commentary field below in my YouTube channel. You can also read more around vertical development in my homepage. And of course, you can see the other podcasts. Haven't you already seen them all? Finally, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you for watching, and I'm wishing you all the best. Bye-bye.